Right now, as you are reading this, there is a substance inside almost every packaged food in your kitchen. It is in your bread, your salad dressing, your pasta sauce, your yogurt, your breakfast cereal, and your so-called healthy granola bar. It has no nutritional value beyond raw energy. It is chemically engineered to override your brain's ability to feel full. And the global industry built around it is worth over $300 billion a year. That substance is sugar. And the story of how it went from a wild tropical grass in the jungles of New Guinea to the hidden ingredient in nearly everything you eat is one of the most extraordinary, violent, and consequential stories in human history. To understand where sugar came from, you have to go back approximately 10,000 years to the island of New Guinea in the southwestern Pacific. There, in the dense tropical forests, ancient farmers first domesticated a tall, thick-stemmed grass called sugarcane. The earliest people to discover it did not process it, refine it, or turn it into anything. They simply chewed the raw stalks and enjoyed the sweet juice inside. For thousands of years, that was sugar, a plant you chewed, nothing more. The knowledge of sugarcane spread slowly westward, moving through Southeast Asia and into India, following the routes of traders, migrants, and wandering monks. And it was in India, sometime around 350 CE, that everything changed. Indian chemists discovered that if you boiled the juice extracted from sugarcane and then dried it, you could produce small granules of solid sweetness, a dry, portable, shelf-stable form of sugar that could be transported, stored, and traded across enormous distances. This was one of the most significant food discoveries in human history, and almost nobody talks about it. The Sanskrit word for this new product was sharkara, which roughly means grit or gravel. That word traveled west, alongside the product itself, becoming sukar in Arabic, zucchero in Italian, sucre in French, and eventually sugar in English. The word you use every single day started as an ancient Indian description of tiny, gritty crystals. By the time the Islamic caliphates rose to power in the 7th and 8th centuries CE, sugar had become one of the most prized commodities in the known world. Arab traders and scholars carried sugarcane cultivation across North Africa, into the Mediterranean, and eventually into Spain and Sicily. Wherever Arab civilization spread, sugar followed. And in the Arab world, sugar was not just food, it was medicine. Arab physicians prescribed it for dozens of conditions, from digestive disorders to respiratory infections to fevers. Medieval Arabic cookbooks are filled with elaborate sugar confections, spiced sweets, and medicinal syrups that read more like a pharmacist's manual than a recipe collection. When European crusaders arrived in the Middle East during the 11th and 12th centuries, most of them had never tasted sugar in their lives. Europe at that time ran almost entirely on honey for sweetness, and honey was expensive, seasonal, and limited in supply. The Crusaders tasted sugar and were immediately captivated. One chronicler from the First Crusade wrote that the soldiers discovered a plant resembling a reed, from which they sucked sweetness with great pleasure. When the Crusaders eventually returned home, they brought sugar with them, and the European appetite for it never recovered its innocence. Pay attention to what happens next, because this is the point where sugar stops being a story about food and starts being a story about power. By the 15th century, sugar was spreading across European trade routes and becoming one of the most lucrative goods a merchant could carry. But sugarcane is an extraordinarily demanding crop. It requires specific tropical conditions, enormous amounts of water, and, Crucially, an enormous amount of brutal physical labor to harvest. The cane stalks must be cut by hand, a task so physically punishing that it destroys the human body within years. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to solve this problem in the way that would define the next 4 centuries of world history. They established sugar plantations on the Atlantic islands of Madeira and São Tomé, and when they could not find enough willing laborers, they enslaved people from the African continent to do the work. The plantation model was born. When Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492, he carried sugarcane cuttings with him. On his second voyage in 1493, he planted them in what is now the Dominican Republic. Within decades, the Caribbean islands, which had the perfect tropical climate for sugarcane, became the center of the global sugar trade. And with them came the largest forced migration in human history. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 12.5 million Africans were captured, enslaved, and transported to the Americas. The majority of them ended up working on sugar plantations in Brazil, in Cuba, in Haiti, in Jamaica, in Barbados. On those islands, life expectancy for enslaved workers on sugar plantations was sometimes as low as 7 to 10 years after arrival. The work was so lethal that planters calculated it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and import more than to keep them healthy. Let that sit for a moment. The sweetness in a cup of European tea in the 18th century was purchased with a human life. Britain became the dominant sugar empire in the Caribbean by the late 17th century, and what followed was an economic feedback loop that reshaped the entire Atlantic world. British merchants traded manufactured goods to Africa in exchange for enslaved people. Those enslaved people were shipped to Caribbean plantations in what became known as the Middle Passage. The plantations produced sugar, rum, and molasses. Those products were shipped back to Britain and sold at enormous profit. The profits funded more ships, more manufactured goods, and more enslaving raids on the African coast. This triangle of trade made Britain extraordinarily wealthy. The port of Bristol, and later Liverpool, grew rich almost entirely on the profits of this system. Some historians argue that the capital accumulated through the sugar and slave trade helped directly finance the early stages of the British Industrial Revolution. The machines and factories that would change the world were built, at least in part, on sugar money. In British homes, sugar consumption rose at a staggering rate. In 1700, the average British person consumed approximately 4 pounds of sugar per year. By 1800, that number had risen to 18 pounds. By 1900, it was 90 pounds. A substance that had been a rare luxury for medieval European royalty had, within 2 centuries, become a daily habit for ordinary working-class people. And here is the detail that most history books overlook. The British working class was not simply choosing to eat more sugar because they liked it. They were eating more sugar because sugar had become an affordable caloric substitute for more expensive foods. Bread and sugar, tea and sugar. Jam on bread, cheap, energy-dense, nutritionally hollow combinations that kept factory workers running through long industrial shifts without actually nourishing them properly. The industrial age ran on sugar, just as surely as it ran on coal. Slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833. But the sugar industry did not collapse. It adapted. Planters in the Caribbean turned to a system of indentured labor, bringing hundreds of thousands of workers from India and China under contracts that, while technically not slavery, left workers with almost no rights and almost no realistic way to return home. Meanwhile, a completely different part of the world was quietly preparing to transform the sugar industry again. In the late 18th century, a Prussian chemist named Andreas Marggraf discovered that a common European root vegetable, the sugar beet, contained sucrose that was chemically identical to the sucrose found in sugarcane. His student, Franz Karl Achard, spent decades developing a method to extract and refine that sucrose commercially. When Napoleon Bonaparte's naval blockades cut off Caribbean sugar supplies to continental Europe in the early 1800s, Napoleon himself ordered the rapid development of the sugar beet industry as a strategic response. French and German chemists threw themselves into the problem, and within a generation, sugar beet refineries were producing enough sugar to challenge Caribbean cane sugar in European markets. Today, approximately 40% of the world's sugar supply comes from sugar beets, grown in temperate climates across Europe, North America, and Asia. The tropical monopoly on sweetness had been broken. By the 20th century, the sugar industry faced a new challenge from an unexpected direction, not from beet sugar, not from cane sugar, but from a corn derivative that would prove to be one of the most consequential and controversial food ingredients ever invented. In the 1970s, researchers developed an efficient industrial process for converting cornstarch into a syrup with an extremely high fructose content. They called it high-fructose corn syrup. It was cheaper to produce than cane or beet sugar, easier to transport as a liquid, and blended seamlessly into processed foods and beverages. The timing was perfect, or disastrous, depending on how you look at it. American food manufacturers had been searching for ways to cut production costs since the 1950s, as competition in the packaged food industry intensified. High-fructose corn syrup arrived just as the processed food industry was beginning its exponential expansion, and the two phenomena fed each other in a loop that would reshape the American diet and, eventually, the global diet. By the 1980s, high-fructose corn syrup had replaced sugar in Coca-Cola, Pepsi, most commercial bread, most ketchup, most breakfast cereals, and hundreds of other products. The average American today consumes roughly 17 teaspoons of added sugar per day, most of it invisible, hidden inside products that do not even taste sweet. And this is where the story of sugar stops being historical and becomes deeply personal. The scientific evidence linking excessive sugar consumption to metabolic disease has been accumulating for decades, but the path to that evidence was deliberately obstructed. In the 1960s, a group of Harvard researchers published a series of influential papers arguing that dietary fat was the primary cause of heart disease. Those papers shaped public health policy for the next 40 years. What the public did not know at the time was that the sugar industry had secretly funded that research. Internal documents uncovered by investigators in 2016 revealed that the Sugar Research Foundation had paid the equivalent of approximately $50,000 in today's money to 3 Harvard scientists to produce findings that would shift blame away from sugar and toward fat. The researchers never disclosed that funding, and one of them later became the head of nutrition at the United States Department of Agriculture. The result was 4 decades of public health advice telling Americans to eat low-fat food, and the food industry responded by removing fat from products and replacing it with sugar, because low-fat food without sugar tastes like cardboard. Americans ate less fat and more sugar, and rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome climbed steadily for 4 decades. The World Health Organization now recommends that adults consume no more than 25 grams of added sugar per day. A single can of regular soda contains approximately 39 grams. Today, The global sugar industry operates across more than 100 countries. Brazil, India, China, Thailand, and Pakistan are among the largest producers. The crop still requires intensive labor in many regions, and human rights organizations continue to document exploitative working conditions on sugarcane plantations in parts of South America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. The parallels to the chocolate industry are uncomfortable and precise. A product that delivers extraordinary pleasure to consumers in wealthy countries continues to be produced under conditions of hardship and exploitation in poorer ones. But something is shifting, slowly. Governments around the world are beginning to act. Mexico, the United Kingdom, South Africa, and several other countries have introduced taxes on sugary drinks. Some have required warning labels on high-sugar products. Public health campaigns are changing the way people understand the ingredient that has been quietly infiltrating their food supply for decades. The bean-to-bar movement in chocolate has its equivalent in the sugar world: small producers of unrefined, minimally processed sugars, cane juice products, coconut sugars, and heritage varietals, who argue that the problem is not sucrose itself, but what industrial processing does to it, and what the food industry does with it. Whether those movements can shift the momentum of a $300 billion industry remains an open question. Think about the full arc of what sugar has done to the world. A wild grass chewed by farmers in New Guinea 10,000 years ago became the economic engine of the Atlantic slave trade. It fueled the Industrial Revolution. It shaped the modern food system. It funded scientific deception at the highest levels of public health, and it now sits inside almost every processed food on the planet, driving a global epidemic of preventable disease. No other ingredient has traveled further, caused more human suffering, or embedded itself more deeply into the structures of civilization. Sugar has been currency and medicine, luxury and weapon, comfort and poison. And the next time you pick up a food package and look at the nutrition label, look for it. It will be there. It almost always is, often under a name you do not recognize: dextrose, maltose, evaporated cane juice, fruit juice concentrate, agave nectar, or any of the other 56 names the food industry uses for the same molecule. 10,000 years after those first farmers in New Guinea chewed a sweet stalk of grass and felt something light up inside them, that same molecule is still chasing you. It found its way into your bread, your sauce, your breakfast, and your bloodstream. The question now is whether you are consuming it, or whether it is consuming you. If you made it all the way here, thank you for watching. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, and drop a comment below telling me the most surprising thing you learned today. I read every single one, and I will see you in the next video.